Hi, Isaac.
Rabbi, good morning. So good to see you.
Good morning. Good morning. Wow. Right through the parable of salt to the words of Jesus on abolishing the law, and now right to murdering and anger. That seems like the natural progression.
Mhm. Do you see any form of pattern in this in chapter five? Like it starts with it starts with the Sermon on the Mount, and then from there it moves to salt and light, and then the law, the prophets, and now to anger. And anyway, so they all seem kind of jarring when you look at them, like, or it seems so bizarre to jump from one to the other. But do you see any consistent pattern or something which links them all together?
So that's a great question. So I know we said that there's five teachings that are kind of thrown throughout into Matthew that are generally viewed as paralleling either the Pentateuch or how the books of Psalms are having five teachings. But when you look, what you're noting is when you look at the actual teachings, the Sermon on the Mount, it somewhat seems to be discontinuous. It seems to be that it's all over the place. And I think once we're done with the Sermon on the Mount in 3 years from now, once we finish getting to that, we'll be able to see the whole arc. But one thing I just want to note for you, it's very important. So when you look at Mishnaic teachings, that's the rabbinic teachings from the second century BC is the earliest, and the latest ones are maybe from the early third century to the middle of the third century. What we find is really, really interesting. This exact parallel that there'll be a topic, any topic, let's say blessings, or what's the one I just did? I just did the one on Passover. I did my son, and on Passover it breaks and it says a completely side point about three times they did it this way, three times they did this, and it was nothing to do with anything. And what you see is that there was almost like this train of thought that we almost don't exist. We can't experience it anymore because first, when we write books, we always make sure we have an intro, we have our points, we have our arguments, conclusions. But we see that they almost had in their oral living teachings, their oral writings, that there was this train of thought that interruptions were memorization tactics in order to have an understanding of the whole picture. So I see a very strong parallel here that either you could say that these teaching, like, listen, historically, it's all said in the Sermon on the Mount, great. Non-historically, maybe these are just random teachings that we want to stick to take place on the Sermon on the Mount. But, or you could look at this rabbinic model, which I think is so interesting, that you'll have these side points, these literally tangents that it will not fit in, but it will be in that text because it has to go somewhere. So right now, the question is, what would be to frame your question differently? What would be a tangent for the Sermon on the Mount? What would be something that when you read the Sermon on the Mount, you're like, this shouldn't be here? Should parables, allegories about salt and light not be here? Should a disclaimer about abrogating the law not be here? Like, so I think once we get through the whole thing, we could talk more holistically about what it should take. But it's a good question what a tangent even means in this context.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for the background context. The evangelist comes across as being highly intelligent. He starts with "Blessed are you, blessed are these." As we discussed, these truths don't change over time, or they're timeless truths. They probably take a different context in each generation. And so I'm at this point, I'm grappling with what is this person. Um, this person had again, this person was of or the author was had a high intellect. He's probably onto something. I'm trying to grapple like you. What
Everyone's
is you?
smart, Isaac. Everyone's smart. we don't recognize quote
That's right.
unquote low intellects. Everyone's smart.
Well, when I mean smart, he's onto something. He like he's weaved these multiple themes together because they probably fit a model. They probably fit a model, and so
Again, what would be interesting, again, I'm sure whenever I say anything, I'm sure someone wrote a book on this, but what would be interesting is to break apart the five non-narrative teachings that are clearly inserted into math. Because like, if you think about how this takes place, we have, it's very easy to break it apart to the birth narrative, and then going to the John narrative, and then going to the beginning of the Jesus discipleship narrative. And this is like a non-narrative text, even though, let's be honest, we could view do not think that I've come to abolish the law as part of the Jesus story narrative as opposed to a law. There's some ambiguity there, but these are generally viewed as the teachings, the preachings that are stuck in here. So it'd be interesting to maybe look at all five teachings separately and see how, if there's a structure to see how that does. Because listen, whenever you're going to look at a book that analyzes Matthew, it's going to break apart the Sermon on the Mount. Like we're going to say the Beatitudes, and what is this section called? It's called the antitheses, right? And the six antitheses, and we're going to have the parable of the salt and the light. So there's very clear sections. Like you can imagine, like for example, you can imagine certain narratives or certain teachings that go straight, like Deuteronomy, the very beginning, the speech that Moses gives the Israelites.
Mhm.
It's like chapters. And
Mhm.
it's very clear that's like one sitting. So over here, if someone said 5:17 to 20, it was one sitting one day, and then 5:21 to 26 was another teaching. Then 5:13 to 5:16
That
was another one.
that could
We
be
will-
okay.
Okay, let's try to
Let's
read
get
one verse.
started. Yeah, the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 5, verse 21. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that anyone who's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire.
Okay, so like I said, we'll probably only be able to talk about the first verse today.
Mhm.
So we'll try to limit our conversation to 21. But there's a lot of points I think that we have to talk about. So first of all, there's a big argument. Well, what are these called? A lot of people call these antitheses because they view this as the opposite of what Judaism would preach. But as we discussed from verses 5:17 to 5:21, that the words of Jesus on the law and the abrogation of the law or not, I think that that actual title is very misleading. Because what we're saying is that this is not the anti-law, the antitheses. Well, what are we saying? We're saying that this is the supererogative law, the leaf name is short and going beyond the letter of the law. So it's very easy to look at this. So if I say, you're not allowed to jaywalk, and then I say, but you shouldn't cross the streets because you shouldn't jaywalk. Am I saying that, no, I'm going one level past, or I'm saying something below that about crossing the street at all? So I think people struggle with what if this is saying, not only don't murder, but don't be angry, or is this saying, don't murder, don't murder, but forget that. That is so low. That shouldn't even be on your mind. If you're murdering, you're not even part of the kingdom of heaven. That's junk. That's like the old school. Now you have to think about, don't even get angry, because that's the new murder. So there's
I
two
think,
very opposite ways to look at this.
yeah, thank you. I think based on 520, he's probably taking this on to a higher level. He's saying because murder is a physical act, and he's probably going deeper to the person's intention. So murder is probably triggered by some form of hate, some form of, which then leads, whichever it comes from anger. And so he's saying, don't be angry, or don't have that hate within you, because that hate and that thing inwardly is what will outwardly lead to murder. And so he's probably speaking at a much deeper level, to your point. Like murder is fine, but I also wanted to go a level. I mean, don't do murder, that's great, but a level higher, which is don't get angry and don't hate somebody else.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of people make the claim that you're making. I don't personally agree with it. The idea that anger leads to murder. So I think that's that claim is that it's almost that anger is a small version of murder. So I view it very differently. So first of all, we all know from our society, most murders today are very planned out to try to hide the body and not get caught. And a lot of times it's not out of anger, it's out of a skill that they're trying to hide, and through cunning. So I feel like it's not a bigger form. And I guess we'll discuss in a couple of moments the relationship to murder and anger. But before we do that, I just want to note the beginning of the verse. There's two really interesting points that we could say in this. So first, you have heard that it was said. So you have heard it said. There's a lot of discussion about what does it mean you have heard. So definitely there is a rabbinic precedent that you have heard. A lot of people will say that this is a straw man. You have heard means that that is wrong, and that sets up the antitheses that this is no longer the case and this is the case. But I think you have heard could also be a different context. You have heard is it very much sounds like he's trying to be almost non-textual. I would say is probably the best way. Like if I'd ask you, Isaac, why does it say you know it is written? That's what it should have said, right? Who doesn't know that the 10 commandments said don't murder? Everyone. So what is Jesus trying to accomplish by saying this idea of hearing versus the idea of knowing, reading, or aware of biblical texts, which he quotes Isaiah every 3 minutes. The least he could do is to quote Exodus and Deuteronomy where the 10 commandments shows up.
Which I meant to ask you this. So it does not say you have heard that it is said in the law, but he uses in those of old. I mean, because
that's the next point, right?
Yeah, and so okay, so
So I'll set this up. Again, we'll set up the second question then. The other point is, what I like to set up our straw man of what we would have expected it to say, and then what it does say. So we would not have expected to say, "You have heard." We've expected that it is written in Exodus and Deuteronomy and Ten Commandments.
That's right.
That's
Yeah.
one. And then it was said to those. This is literally trying to show you that this was like where was it said to those? In the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. And when was that said? In ancient times or to ancient people, depending on how you want to read this. So what's very interesting that when you use ancient times in a Greco-Roman society of the first century, it would always hearken back to a mythological beginning of a Homer-esque beginning. So it's really interesting to try to imagine Jesus as not trying to say that it is written, not trying to cite what your reality is right now. It was written 1,000 years ago and it still applies, don't murder, but it sounds like he's giving 2 points that are very strong that these build. You heard it? When did you hear it? In your, again, like I'm not speaking about history, but in your mythological beginnings at Mount Sinai, you heard it. And who heard it? The ancient ones, those mythological beginning people. So we see, I think, in two very strong points. I think it's very clear that we're trying to create this dichotomy between the Mount Sinai people and these people that are hearing this today. And I'm not trying to expand upon the Beatitudes, that I think this is another Mount Sinai moment, because I don't think the rest of this really fits that Mount Sinai moment like the Beatitudes and the 8 to 10 commandments or Beatitudes, whatever it means. But I think that we have this dichotomy about how to see ethics. And I know you love talking about morality and you love to see.
Absolutely, yeah. Ethics and morality and character,
I think one of the things this opens up is the natural question of the Euthyphro argument that Socrates has between divine commandedness versus natural law. So Socrates argues things are only holy because God commanded them at Mount Sinai or God commanded them at some point. And Euthyphro argues that there's a natural law, there's a natural ethic that human beings, either evolutionary, biologically, intellectually, or maybe chemically, are able to tap into.
And because we also made in the image of God, whatever that means, whatever that term image of God means. So we have the capacity to know, and we have the capacity to know what is good, what is bad, what is acceptable.
So spiritually, we're able to tap into that because we're creating an image of God. That is definitely be a authentic interpretation of that. But I think what we're trying to do here is so interesting. He's trying to say, back in the olden days, you heard, where did you hear? At Mount Sinai. Who heard? The Israelites in the desert. They heard murder was wrong. But why was murder wrong for them? Murder was wrong because it seems to me that they were agreeing with, they were giving this Euthyphro argument that agrees with Euthyphro. Murder is wrong because God commanded it. And if murder is wrong because God commanded it, it's not natural, it's not realistic. It's like God commanded, God could command it, it's okay to murder. That's what you knew in your mythological beginnings. That's how you began. But that is not how we live anymore today. We're now going to exit those mythological beginnings and enter what I would call a kingdom of heaven. And the kingdom of heaven attitude is going to be opposite of the mythological beginnings of the Israelites. It's not going to be like, we're not going to focus on this idea of replacement theology, but it's going to be that there has to be this idea that the messianic era of Jesus and of the kingdom of heaven has to be fundamentally different. I think he's giving a fundamentally different ethic here. And what's interesting, I think a lot of times when we talk about are the Pharisees bad or are they good, we're kind of missing the point. A lot of times the Pharisees, I'll say it in English, the Pharisees are very focused on what? On law. And while they do have a lot of philosophical beliefs behind the things, and if anything, they are more philosophical than the Sadducees from the perspective of creativity and having a deeper theology that's based on non-physical worlds, what we see is that we're arguing that Jesus is going one step farther. He's saying that it's not only about the theology that's created by the Pharisees. We have to go in a messianic kingdom, in a kingdom of heaven. It's even one step farther. And I think that's like this opening line, which I think is a throwaway for most people, is the most important part of these 6 antitheses, that there used to be not a law, but an ethic and morality, an attitude towards murder and towards divorce and adultery, whatever, all the 6, there's an attitude. And that attitude, not the law, is 100% abrogated. The attitude that you have towards anger, the attitude that you have towards murder, the attitude you have towards divorce, all those things is wrong now because we have a different morality now. We have a different ethic than what they heard at Mount Sinai and what they saw at Mount Sinai. And that's why this doesn't quote the actual Bible here, because to actually quote the Bible, that's what it is for contemporaneous first century Jews. That would have been worthless. That wouldn't convey the point that Jesus is trying to say here. Namely, that the ethic is different now. And that's what he's arguing, right? This supererogation, this lifnei mishur adin, this go beyond the law, is saying that the beyond the letter of law is the minimum law. And this is a very, very famous argument throughout Jewish history about, is the minimum or is it maximum? Or it like there's a line that Nachmani says that one of the lines in the Bible says you have to be holy. And Nachmani says that's actually a law, that you have to look at the law and go beyond the letter of the law, very much like what Jesus is doing here. To be holy is to accept a higher morality or an ethic than the minimum that's given in the Bible. So if Jesus cited the Bible here, it would have been a problem.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Thank you for that background. There's just lots of things. So he's making a deep philosophical, he's taking the philosophical discussion to a much higher, to a much deeper level, or the assumptions behind law and what people should do or shouldn't do. What would have been, how would have the Pharisees responded to this? Responded to his, not just saying you're bad, right? But again, what kinds of objections would people have given?
This idea, like the Pharisees themselves, if you look, there's always a yes, no, and a no, a yes guy and a no guy. There's a be more holy, be less holy, do a minimum, do a maximum, create a more ethical life versus just do the minimum. So that controversy, I think, which Jesus is doing, is a first century and second century controversy. The question is, when the Bible says to do something, is that a minimum or maximum? When the Bible says be holy, how does one execute that? When the Bible says you have to give a minimum to your orphans and to your widows, does that mean it says you have to give them enough to satiate them? Is that enough to satiate them, or should you give them enough to live a normal life? When the Bible says execute someone, does that mean just execute them whatever you want? Or does that mean you need 2 witnesses, you need a warning, you need to make sure that a court that executes once every 70 years is called a murderous court because that's too much? The question is, when the Bible sets the precedent, how much should we view that as the minimum? And I think that's the exact controversy that's happening here. There's endless rabbinic texts that deal with this. And I think Jesus is the extreme case. Where
so if these discussions were common, as in do we do the minimum or the maximum? So in light of that, what Jesus says would not have been revolutionary, right? Put this in that context. He's not making things out of thin air. Like these discussions were happening. Is it minimum, maximum?
It's hard to know, Isaac. I think we should always view him as revolutionary because of the nature of the religion, that we see it was such a break and how it lasted. So, but it's hard to separate Jesus from the historical Jesus from the Pauline Jesus. So, but that being said, his attitude toward, we're going to see that his attitude towards anger definitely had precedent. His attitude towards divorce, definitely, we definitely had precedent. All these things had precedent, but I think to preach for the masses in the crowds, this super erogative level would be abnormal. There's in this time period, there's a group of people called the Chaverim, the friends, or another way to say the cohort of stricter believers. And throughout the mission, there's this idea these people were much more strict about purity laws. Eventually they die out or they disappear, but it's so important that this group exists and they can't intermingle properly with the masses. Because if you don't care about purity laws and I do, we can't eat a meal together, we can't marry together, we can't do anything. And what we see here is that this is a hybrid kind of model we're getting presented here. For the most part, we don't see purity laws as which is the main difference in the first century between people who keep strict levels and don't. Yet we see purity being a high point in like through baptism, a very important point, but it's used a little bit differently. So I think it's not about the question isn't is he revolutionary or not. The question is, how did he get his hybrid model? How effective was it? Was it something that people would have accepted or not? I do think he is to the super left of center and things, to the right, like divorce, he's to the right of center if you're a Catholic. So I do think he's an extreme model, and a lot of times extremes are viewed as revolutionaries, but he's always has to be seen within this first century framework, because he could have said there's no such thing as marriage. He could have said there's no such thing as adultery. And let's be honest, there are societies that don't have these concepts. So he's always using that framework, but I definitely would always stick that label of revolutionary on him without thinking twice.
Okay. So when people heard him, right, what would have been, so okay, if you and I were the first century people who heard him, what would have been so different about what he's saying?
This is becoming your weekly question as opposed to the historical one. I'd like to have the historical question leaving out to the crowd.
Yeah, so because Pauline Jesus, it took on a whole new level. I get that. With Paul, his theology, it took on a whole level. But at this point, he's just an ordinary person, a rabbi with a few group of people around him. As you noticed, it's not that different from some of the other discussions or philosophical assumptions in place. So what would people have thought about? Like, they would have heard about this, like yeah, this is another guy who has nothing else to do, who just
the gospel tells us how the people responded to him throughout the gospel, right? It wasn't super positive.
Yeah.
But we also see that John was super. It frames John as being very successful and Jesus being less successful, right? That's like a horrible overgeneralization, but it's definitely the way it's framed. And I think you can ask questions upon that. A lot of times the Gospels were written so much later after the ministries of John and Jesus, that they're also dealing with the question of what happened between the years 30 to 120. So they're dealing with the reception as well. And we can't decipher or pull out the lines they're dealing with the actual reception versus not. So it's really hard to know authentically what the crowd's responding. You can't just say, John, they love John, they don't like Jesus as much. That's too much.
So it sounds like you're saying, thank you for, so it sounds like you're saying, in terms of the Pharisees and Sadducees, they hated him not because of what he said, but because the crowds followed him. Because what he said is not that revolutionary, but there are people who had similar opinions, who were able to, had certain things, but he was able to get the attention of the masses in the way in which.
It's not inherently wrong to claim you're a Messiah. If I would claim I'm Messiah today, people would say you're a loony ball, but okay, as I mentioned to you before, let's take out the checklist and see if you could fulfill the things of the Messiah. So I think if he said that, it would have been, I think the Magi coming to town in front of Herod would have been more controversial than Jesus just saying he's
Messiah.
Yeah, and I think when John kind of came out with whatever he did, and for whatever reason he was executed, which I don't know how much we talked about that, but it's hard to know how much people would have responded positively or negatively based on. Okay, let's just do a couple more things before we finish. Okay, so we discussed the idea of Euthyphro versus Socrates, about how that would be received. What's also interesting, just a lot of times if you go to a synagogue, you'll see that, like my synagogue in Hollywood will have the 10 Commandments on the wall, but not written out. It'll have like two little 10 Commandments rocks, and it'll say in Hebrew 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And in general, that's how people imagine the 10 Commandments being broken, even though there's tremendously more words in the first 5 than the second 5. A lot of times Jews, when they talk about the first 5, they consider it to be between man and God, and the second 5 they consider it to be between man and man. Is a Hebrew phrase as being Adam Lamakom, between man and God. So for example, the first one is an argument with that they are, but let's just pretend this is how it works. I'm your Lord your God. Don't do idolatry. Don't bow down. Keep the Sabbath and honor your parents. They view that as like a relationship with God. And the next 5 is relationship with man. What I find super interesting is that if Jesus is going to be this theological theocrat who is pushing the God perspective more than anything else, which 10 commandments would you expect him to focus on? Which the first 5 or the second 5?
I would say the first 5.
Obviously the first 5. And obviously, like when let's rewrite this first 5:21. You have heard that I am the one Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. But now I, Jesus, am your one Lord God who took you out of Jordan, whatever. So you could imagine very easily an attitude towards you see, this is a focus on the 10 Commandments still. You can imagine an attitude towards the 10 Commandments would be very different. So I find it super interesting that it starts at number 6. And again, it doesn't go. There's 6 antitheses, and they don't really go straight through it. And I'm not trying to make a claim that all these have to be 10 Commandments, but the fact that the first one is number 6, I think is so interesting because it shows that the way to have the kingdom of heaven is by actually living a certain life in the physical world.
Oh man, that's Rabbi Sachs. Thank you.
I know, but I do think it's a little bit in contradistinction or contrasting with, like, I think the attitude that we take towards death, or towards attitudes towards Jesus in general. A lot of times, if you're a Christian today, the attitude will be what? Believe in Jesus, and that's all it takes.
That's Pauline theology. I get that. His
Pauline theology that goes to the Catholic Church is doing works, doing a lot of stuff. And anything I equate it more with Protestant Christianity and with Martin Luther, because in the end, it's all about the belief. That's what I think. That's again, I don't want to summarize Martin Luther in this trivial way, but
No,
that's
it's true. It's true. It's not. There are two sides of the coin. It feels like we've
right.
stressed so much upon that, the lesser aspect of what it is to be again to meet the law. So here's my favorite question to you, the one I've probably asked you multiple times. Thank you for that observation, right? That this starts with the sixth commandment and not the first five. So my question is, did the evangelist on purpose leave out the first five? Did Jesus probably, do you think he might have said something, but the evangelist on
So I'm
purpose left?
arguing yes. I'm arguing that. Well, first of all, this isn't perfectly parallel to the Ten Commandments. I
Yeah.
want to start by saying like this argument is wishy-washy a little bit because we don't go through 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That doesn't happen.
Mhm.
But that being said, and if anything, it could be that these 6 that are mentioned are just the most fundamental things for society: marriage, relation of men and women. But what we see is that I'm trying to make the argument. Yeah, it starts with murder and skips the first 5. After we talk about the abrogation of the law, it'd be nice if he talked about philosophy or theology. But now he talks specifically about murder and anger, and I think that's really about your relationship not with God as much as your relationship with yourself. Again, in Hebrew we say bein adam la'adam, between man to man. That's how we actually categorize this commandment.
Mhm.
Okay. So the last point I just want to throw out there, which is super interesting, and this I guess has to do a little bit with the next one. But we're meant to contrast murder to anger, and we already spoke about: is it a higher? Is anger the root of murder, or is it a fortiori argument? Is it
Mhm.
not only can you not murder, you can't even be angry? And I thought you would find it so interesting, the negative attitude that Judaism has towards anger. So there's a million vices, right? There's a million things aside from the seven deadly sins. There's a million things that you could do wrong, but anger and jealousy, for that matter, but anger specifically, is viewed as one of the worst in Judaism. I'll give you 2 examples. In Maimonides' writings, it's called Midot and Characteristics, in the 2nd chapter, he talks about how you're not allowed to be angry, and if you get angry ever, you should fake it. Like, for example, let's say you're the mayor or the president, and you want to think it's good for your soldiers or for your townspeople to think that you're angry. You should pretend to be angry, because you should never be angry. And he puts this in the contrast to the golden mean. There's the idea that should you be rich or should you be wealthy? Maimonides says, be in the middle. Don't give away all your money to charity, but don't give away no money to charity. Should you be happy or should you be content or melancholy? You shouldn't be frivolously happy all the time and just joking all the time, but you also shouldn't be too serious all the time. And he goes to like 100 characteristics, and each one you should be the golden mean. Aristotle's golden mean, be in the middle. But the 2 he says exception for is anger and jealousy. So anger, he says, he quotes the verse I think from Proverbs, and Proverbs he learns from the verse in Proverbs that to be angry is to be idolatrous. And idolatry in Maimonides' language and the language of the Old Testament and the Tanakh is the worst thing. If you're idolatrous, you're going to hell. There's nothing worse than that. So to be angry is to be an idolater. So just like you lose control when you're angry, just like you have no connection to God if you're being idolatrous, you have no connection to yourself or God when you are angry. So I think that the perspective in Proverbs and in Maimonides would have been well respected, to have this this attitude towards anger, that there's nothing worse. So just to be clear, in Maimonides it says never ever be angry, and he says, like, when Moses got angry, it says like Sof Moses got angry. He says that was like a massive problem. He's actually Maimonides is very critical of even Moses, saying one should never get angry. So when we see this line, I think the attitude towards anger would have been very appreciated in that time period. I don't think it's a real fortiori argument, that you can't kill all the more, so you can't. But I think it's very important to see that parallel, that killing is one of the worst sins you do, and anger is viewed as bad as idolatry, one of the worst sins you could do to yourself.
Mhm. So, well, thank you for quoting Maimonides and anger. Did Maimonides make a difference on the anger when Moses had the anger Moses felt when he saw an Egyptian beating up a Hebrew, versus the anger when Moses felt on the mount when people disobeyed them, right? So
Well,
we generally,
generally the first story is not viewed as angry as a proper response. That Moses was an intervener, as we spoke about in the way that
yeah.
Jesus is. So it's not viewed in any way. Mostly it's viewed in later Deuteronomy texts about his anger. So no one views that as a problem, the first one.
I feel like anger is there's both healthy anger and the non-healthy anger. It sounds like in this verse he's against non-healthy anger.
So
I may not.
Maimonides is saying that there's no such thing as healthy anger. He's
Yeah,
saying
that's
that,
that
he
that
says you could feign anger, you could
you
fake
know.
anger. Okay, the very last point, I have to, we have to, with the God willing work.
Yeah.
So the last point, which we're not going to discuss because we'll come back probably once we finish the antitheses, is what does it mean that you're be liable to judgment? Right, that's a good question. About, does it mean judgment in hell and heaven, or does it mean judgment on earth? When you think of a biblical perspective, it always generally means that you are judged on earth. If you think of a Pharisaic perspective, it generally means you're judged in the next world. If you think of Jesus, it's kind of, you can hear both ways. Okay, Isaac, you heard that sound? I have to.
Okay. Rabbi, on that note, thank you. I'll talk
Okay.
to you. Have a great day. Thanks, Rabbi. Thank you.